السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا وأسواتنا محمد الأمين وعلى آله الطاهرين وصحبه الطيبين والتابعين لهم بخير وإحسان إلى يوم الدين وعلينا معهم وفيهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. Beloved brothers and sisters, I wish each and every one of you a blessed Friday. Jumu'atukum Mubarakah bil afiyah, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and bless all your family members. Today, May 19th, is Malcolm X Day. And normally I would be participating with the Muslim community in New York, along with the broader community for the commemoration of Malcolm X Day in New York. And every year there is a ceremony at the qabr, at the cemetery of El Hajj Malik Shabazz, rahmatullah alayh, and his wife, Dr. Al Hajja Betty Shabazz, rahmatullah alayha, at the Ferncliff Cemetery in New York. And then during the daytime, or later on in the day, there is an event commemorating his life in Harlem at the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Center. But this year, I am here and not at that location, though that my heart is there. For the American Muslim community, Malcolm X is a figure of importance, I'd say, of great import, and his life and legacy has some contemporary lessons for us today. And within that vein, within that spirit, I are going to share some thoughts. The faqir is going to share some thoughts, inshallah, in regards to Malcolm X, as we do other times of the year. And inshallah, when we find out the links of the streaming of the ziyarah at Ferncliff Cemetery in Westchester County in New York, that we will try to share that link on social media for those of you who are able to watch either live or in its entirety, and then also find out the Malcolm X Day event in Harlem, normally led by Hajja Professor Ilyasa Shabazz, may Allah preserve her, one of the daughters of Malcolm X, who leads up that endeavor every year. So in regards to the life and legacy of Malcolm X, I'll clarify a few things, because I just heard maybe a day or two ago some people in the community saying that Malcolm X was from Michigan, or that he was born in Michigan and lived in Detroit, and that is not exactly accurate. So Malcolm X, rahmatullah alayh, Al Hajj Malik Shabazz, was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and his family fled, going to Lansing, Michigan. Why? Because the KKK burned down the Little home, because Malcolm X's family name was Little. His father was a preacher, and their family home was burned down because he was seen as being a quote unquote Negro agitator. So this is when Malcolm X's family moved from Omaha, Nebraska to Lansing, Michigan. Then Malcolm X's father died in a tragic way, in which the family believed that he was actually pushed under a streetcar. And this is somewhat disputed as fact, but Malcolm X articulated verbally, and also wrote in his autobiography, that his father, in fact, had been killed by white people. And I think that this is very important to understand in the history and the background of him as a person, his evolution, that he comes not just from a history of trauma of his people, both maternal and paternal lineage, but that his family fled for their lives, and his father actually died, in which he believes at the hands of white supremacists. So Malcolm X's father. Malcolm X's mother was a byproduct of sexual assault, right? And his mother was from Grenada, and she was half white, and that was due to um, a white man sexually assaulting uh, his grandmother, Malcolm's grandmother. Hence, this is how his mother came to be, and hence the light complexion and the reddish hair of Malcolm X relates to the lineage of the white man who sexually assaulted his his grandmother. So this is part of the background of Malcolm X, and again, this plays into um, his background, his narrative. Malcolm X wasn't was a man of global vision. Some call him a black internationalist, and this goes back to his roots. His father was a preacher, a Christian preacher, but was also a member of the United Negro Improvement Association, an organization that was started by Mr. Marcus Garvey, who had a back to Africa type of agenda. He was from Jamaica, and he preached black unity, and that the African diaspora should organize itself, be self-sufficient from white folks, and that eventually that through the connection of economic ties between the Caribbean and America with people of the African diaspora, that eventually that black folks should make their way back out of Africa and get out of the lands that were colonized here in the Americas by the white man. So he heard this preaching from his father at a very young age. His father preferred him over the other siblings, in part because he was the lightest, and he would take him around the state as he was preaching in different cities. His mother was a secretary in the UNIA, so they both had this global vision. Uh, they, uh, they talked about other parts of the world, and this informed Malcolm's worldview. So he did not come into the Nation of Islam as a clean slate. He is of the byproducts and the fruits of his father and his mother, who were religious people, number one. And then number two were also people that had global vision and preached self-independence and not being dependent upon the government or seeking to curry favor from, and I'll use Malcolm's language, not my language, but white liberals. This was Malcolm X's language. So Malcolm X grew up wayward, getting in trouble. He went to Boston to stay with his sister, Hajja Ella Collins, rahmatullah alayha, who you know died as Sunni. His older half sister, because Malcolm X's father had children from a previous relationship before marrying his mother. So he had other siblings, and she lived in Boston, and she was a wealthy woman, an educated woman, and a wealthy woman. And Malcolm went to Boston, then New York. He got in trouble, and then he went to prison. This is when in prison, he was given the teachings of the Nation of Islam by his brothers, who came and introduced the teachings to him because they had joined the nation before. Wilford and Filbert, his two brothers, had embraced the teachings. Now, what is interesting about the Nation of Islam before Malcolm X came, is that by the time Malcolm got out, and by the way, there were only four, what we could say, Nation of Islam temples, right? There was the first one in Detroit, the second one in Chicago, the third in Milwaukee, and the fourth in Washington, D.C. So when Malcolm got out of prison, and he came to Detroit. He actually stayed with his brother in Inkster, Michigan. And by the way, the house that Malcolm X used to live in with his brother has been purchased, and to my understanding, is being rehabbed into being a type of like uh, museum in the city of Inkster honoring Malcolm X. It has not been completed yet, to my understanding, but inshallah, God willing, when that's finished, we will put out the word about that. That's very important. Inksters are very important. But he came to the city of Detroit, and where Masjid Wali Muhammad is located off of Linwood and Burlingame, on the west side of Detroit, across from Central High School. This is the first place where Malcolm preached. And when Malcolm X came into the nation, there were at the most throughout these four cities 4,000 members of the Nation of Islam. By the time Malcolm left the Nation of Islam the year before his martyrdom, uh, it had grown to 400,000 registered members, not including the sympathizers. So the growth in the Nation of Islam is directly tied to the charisma and to the organizational skills of Malcolm, because Malcolm just wasn't a preacher. He was an organizer. He was a grassroots man. He had boots on the ground. He put in real work, and he organized and sacrificed. Also, of Malcolm's um, Malcolm's what he started were two very important things. First, the discipline of the Nation of Islam, or what we call the FOI, the Fruit of Islam. This is a project of Malcolm, and we would call this today, in according to traditional Islam, the Fatuwa training, of training young men, discipline, uh, etiquettes, following orders, a level of hierarchy, learning martial arts, how to protect themselves. This was started by Malcolm. The second thing that he started was the Muhammad Speaks newspaper, which first he used to write, or not himself. He arranged with some black newspapers for articles from Mr. Elijah Muhammad, like the Pittsburgh Courier, for instance. And then he started the Muhammad Speaks, which then morphed later into what we know as the Muslim Journal, with Imam Wafdi Muhammad's community, rahmatullahi alayhi, and then when Farrakhan split off from Imam Wafdi Muhammad and Naqshbandi, rahmatullahi alayhi, in 1979, then what was called the Final Call. But the very seeds for this and the starting of this, of independent black newspapers that had Islamic nomenclature and was at least calling to a type of proto-Islam in the nation. This was the creation of El Hajj Malik Shabazz. So again, he just was not an orator. He just was not an analyst. He was an organizer, and he actually also built things. And this again, to my point of what American Muslims can learn today. He built these things independent of outside funding, right? The Nation of Islam was not getting government funding, of course. The Nation of Islam wasn't getting big grant money from liberal, or now what we call progressive foundations, like the NAACP, for instance, right? The NAACP actually, its founding president and the funders actually were Jewish Americans. They, a lot of the funding came from outside. And this is a well-known historical fact, even about the March on Washington. Like a lot of the funders behind that, and the direction of that actually was steered away from its original militancy, we can say, and it was taken over. And Malcolm X actually gave a critique on that, about how that movement was, the original intent of the March on Washington basically was hijacked. I believe that speech is called Message to the Grassroots, if you want to take a look at or look it up. And he also gave another seminal speech, which was on the backside of the LP, called The Battle of the Bullet. And I'm old enough to have actually had the vinyl recording of that I had it passed down, and you play the the record, 33 and a third vinyl on the record player. On one side was the message to the grassroots, the other side, Battle of the Bullet. So this is important, right? Uh, Malcolm was able to have an independent voice because he wasn't funded by outsiders, right? This is very important. Now, Malcolm X, when he left the Nation of Islam, he really was only about a Sunni for about a year. So, but the last year of his life was so busy, it was so packed. So there's a there's a few points to make. Number one, as it is true that Malcolm X's Hajj was transformative, and he came back and said that if the white man in America studied Islam, that it could do for him what it did for white people that he was with, because he was in a tent and he was able to, as he said, he prayed with Muslims who were white, had white skin. He ate from the same plate and drank from the same cup as white men. But it is to say, too, that Malcolm X was a world traveler before and was very aware and astute that there were other Muslims in the world who were white prior to him becoming a Sunni. But this interaction and this play of this actual time and the spiritual impact of Hajj was transformative for him. He spent 5 months overseas at this time. Uh, his Hajj was majority funded by his sister, Hajja Ella Collins, rahmatullah alayha. His sister, or one could say half sister, funded this endeavor when he went overseas. And Malcolm was treated like a de facto ambassador for African American people. So, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was more beloved, perhaps amongst many people uh, in the Black community, especially in the South, the worldwide respect and impact of the two cannot be accurately measured per se, but it is safe to say that Malcolm's global impact in the East, in the Muslim world, and throughout Africa was of greater impact than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We can safely say that. There was he was a there are two things that indicate this. One is that his travels through Africa, there was the meaning of the Organization of African Unity. And this is when African states that were first getting out of the yoke of colonialism, they came and they met in a meeting. It was the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, who was the founding president of the free country of Ghana, where one of my teachers, my Murabi, Sheikh Ali Suleiman Ali Hafizullah Ta'ala, was born and raised in Ghana. The likes of Jomo Kenyatta, who was the founding president of the Republic of Kenya that got free from British, and one of the leaders of the Mau Mau, which was a resistance group, armed resistance group in Kenya that got freedom. The likes of Jamal, or Egyptians would say Gamal, Jamal Abdel Nasser was also an attender at that meeting, who was the leader of Egypt after the deposing of King Farouk of Egypt, when the king was deposed. And by the way, the kings and the monarchies in the Arab world are basically creations or kings that were propped up by the British, such as Saudi Arabia. Like, this is a known fact, right? That the Saudis funded and gave weapons to Ali Saud, to the family of Saud, and supported them in their armed uprising against the Turks, or the Ottomans, and then Al Sheikh, the descendants of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, gave them the religious cover, and by declaring the Ottomans to be kuburiyin, or being grave worshippers, being um, basically idolaters, and then by declaring the Uthmaniyya and also those Arabs who were connected to them as being uh, polytheists or outside of Islam, then that made their blood lawful for them to be fought against. This is a very important history to understand what's going on in the so-called Middle East today. This history is very important. So Malcolm was at this meeting, and he was given a honorary chair, almost like an ambassador. So you had all these African countries that had gotten their freedom. Of course, South Africa still was not free yet. Southern Rhodesia or Zimbabwe was not free yet. They were still under apartheid at the time. But Malcolm X was there, and he was the only non-head of state that was allowed to attend the meeting and was given a chair. So basically, Malcolm X was treated as the de facto leader of Muslims, excuse me, of African people in the West, in America, in the Caribbean. Malcolm X was treated like the head of state, so to speak. And this is where he saw this meaning in the structure, and he came back and he established, after he established Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which now grew out of that, is the Mosque of Islamic Brotherhood, which is in Harlem, where Imam Talib Abdul Rashid Hafidullah Ta'ala is the imam after becoming imam after Sheikh Tawfiq Rahmatullah alayh, the founding imam of that masjid, who was an Azhar graduate. After Malcolm started Muslim Mosque Incorporated, firstly, then he started the organization of Afro-American Unity, patterned after the organization of African Unity. So he spent 5 months there and making a lot of connections. Malcolm came back, and then he went back again. And this is also a very important historical point, that Malcolm spent a number of months in Egypt. He was a guest of the Egyptian government and a guest of Sheikh al-Azhar, Mahmoud Shaltut Rahmatullah alayh. And he went through what we could say a Deen intensive, staying in Qahira or Cairo. And to our to our knowledge, Malcolm X is the first African American to get any sort of ijaza or permission to teach anything from Al Azhar. So the likes of us who've studied, who are African Americans and got ijaza from different teachers, who we have our SNED, or those who studied in Azhar or in Damascus or in Malaysia or Turkey, West Africa, like in Mali and Senegal. Malcolm X is our sabiq, or he is our forerunner in this endeavor of actually getting ijaza and getting sanad back to the righteous early generations. So this is also a very important point that we should know and understand within our history of Islam in the United States of America. So he was given permission to give dawah from Jamal Azhar, from El Jamal Azhar or El Azhar University. So for those who would say that Malcolm X didn't know Islam or didn't have the right aqidah, didn't have the right creed, well, he was given license from El Azhar University, and they tested him that he had correct mainstream, or as they said back in the day, orthodox Islamic aqidah. He was not on the aqidah of Nation of Islam. And he came back, and of course, he was martyred in 1965, in February 1965, in the Audubon Theater in Harlem, New York, which is now the Malcolm X and Dr. Betty Shabazz Center. Now, some contemporary points that I'd like to touch on as lessons for us as Muslims in America, Michigan, or Muslims in Michigan, but Muslims in America in general. And I guess this is something that we can also glean for African Americans who are watching, or Latinos who are watching, maybe who are not Muslim. It's very important points. Um, the first of these that we go back to is that the activities of Malcolm X, rahmatullahi, be he in the nation or outside the nation, that he was funded at the grassroots level. So, of course, he was not funded as much as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., for instance. I mentioned his name earlier, even though Dr. King's financial support dried up at the last year and a half of his life when he started speaking against the Vietnam War. Then those liberals, those people turned against him, and his funding started to dry up. But how Malcolm was able to be so bold and be so courageous is that he had independence, and he was not dependent on money outside of his community or his people to for his message. Uh, he wasn't dependent on liberal uh, foundations or white-led organizations for funding for his message. When he became Muslim, uh, he was not given money from the government of Saudi Arabia for the Muslim World League. They didn't line his pockets, even though they claimed they were going to give him support for his message. Malcolm X left this earth as a man who was broke. He was Zahid. He was Zahid in the Nation of Islam. His to the extent that his wife complained even about Dr. Betty Rahmatullah Alayha, about their living conditions, about not having as much wealth or having new clothes as other ministers in the Nation of Islam who were high up. Um, and when he became a Sunni, uh, they were not living what we could say a comfortable middle class life, right? But this is how Malcolm was able to keep his independence. So there's a lesson for us today as far as those who plan on getting activism or community organizing, those who plan on getting to it. And this is a message for those of us who are activists in community organizing, that uh, there's a saying, who funds you runs you. And for our community, if we're going to have dignity, we cannot be chained up by money from outsiders if we're going to be totally independent or have the type of courage and stick to our principles like Malcolm. Because these foundations, be it to the left or be it to the right, they have a strategic plan, they have a strategy, and they don't give money simply because they like us. It's because we fit into their plan. And this has the effect of one or two things. Either they see that we are propagating a message that is primarily within their strategic plan about what they want to execute or put forward, in which we are not the center of that. Maybe we are used by that, or by accepting that money, it muzzles us in speaking the hawk when it's time to speak the hawk, to speak the truth, out of fear that we'll lose our foundation money. And I've seen this happen amongst Muslim organizations to the extent that in the last decade or so, I've seen platforms and even organizations started within by Muslims that receive total funding from outside the Muslim community, which then put forth political positions that go outside of mainstream Islam on certain issues. Why? Because it's serving the interests of those who gave them the money. And so this is what we need to learn from the life of Malcolm X. For those who talk about Malcolm X and his boldness, that talk about Malcolm X speaking truth to power. Well, uh, he just didn't speak truth to power to white conservatives, which gets me to the second part, or blatant racists that were to the right. Number two, Malcolm, to this point, he said, he said, and he made the analogy for African American people. He said that the conservatives were like wolves, and the liberals, or we could say now liberals or progressives, are like foxes. And he said many times that the fox is more likely to get the lamb chopped than the wolf. Why is that? because the wolf howls. The wolf makes a lot of noise, whereas the fox is sly. Even if you and Malcolm even said, even if you see a fox from from a close distance, you'll see that he even goes like this, that he'll show his teeth almost like he's smiling. So the fox acts like they're your friend, while the wolf is howling. So many times we're able to protect our sheep or our chickens easier from the howl of the wolf than from the silent, sly fox. This was Malcolm's critique. So he actually viewed and talked about the liberal establishment was actually a bigger, posed a bigger problem for African Americans than the conservatives, right? And of course, we know that the Vietnam War was actually started by who? It was started by so-called liberal President John F. Kennedy, who, by the way, uh, is the one who gave permission for Robert F. Kennedy during the counterintelligence program led by J. Edgar Hoover and FBI to actually spy on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who spied on all the black leaders. You know, even though they would bring them to the White House or meet with them, they were spying on them and seeking to undermine them the entire time while they acted like they were their friends, right? So this is a lesson for us to learn that if we're going to stand in the shoes of Malcolm and learn from Malcolm, is that in our political savviness, we're not to see either side as like being unconditional allies, right? We don't give our allegiance to the political platform of the progressives and say we're progressive Muslims, nor in response to that go far to the right. And then we say that we're going to be um, far right Muslims or MAGA Muslims. Like both of these are extremes. And for most part, we've gone all the way to the left where uh, we will support. We have people in our community who support. A lot of this has to do with, I believe, uh, uh, fear, right? uh, Fear, more fear of people than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That we have given unconditional allegiance almost to the progressive left. And, you know, by Allah, you know, our community, we are not facing impending danger to have this type of fear or this type of, it's nothing like what my father and mother went through in the days of Jim Crow. Like American Muslims aren't even in the worst after 9/11, didn't even face a tenth of what my parents and grandparents have gone through in this country. Even me growing up in a semi-rural area in the 1980s in Virginia, right? So uh, American Muslims don't lack capital. We don't lack capital, meaning financial capital, intellectual capital. We're quite wealthy in that. So we don't have a deficit of capital. We have a deficit of confidence and courage. And Malcolm can be a source for us of getting this confidence and getting this courage, because when we look at the likes of Malcolm, he is a reflection. I heard Dr. Umar Farouk Abdullah, rahmatullah alayhi, say this, and it's something for you to chew on. He said that Malcolm X is like our Imam Hussein, bid'Allah ta'ala wa salamu alayhi. He's like our Imam Hussein in America, right? He's like our Imam Hussein in America. Why? Because what's the significance of Imam Hussein? Why would he say this? Because Imam Hussein spoke the truth. Imam Hussein didn't give bay'ah, or he didn't swear allegiance to a governmental authority or leadership that he saw as being corrupt, right? And yes, Sayyidina Hussein, he held the position, and he said before his martyrdom that he said, uh, death in dignity, right? That death in dignity is better than life in humiliation. And we see this in the likes of Malcolm X, rahimahullah ta'ala. Even to the extent on the day of his martyrdom in February 1965, that he even had his wife and his daughters on the front row and they witnessed his martyrdom, just as Sayyidina Hussein's wife and sister and daughters saw his martyrdom at Karbala. Ridwanullah ta'ala alayhim ajma'in. So this is the second lesson. And then the third lesson from Malcolm, and this ties back to the other things that Malcolm X, as much as he talked about um, international politics, as much as he talked about getting free from colonialism and neocolonialism, as much as he talked about racism and, critiqued the false ideology of white supremacy, he always called his people to be morally upright. And he always preached and taught that if we were to be morally upright and get ourselves together, that God himself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, would intervene in our affairs and fix our issues. And by Allah, for a number of issues that we face here domestically, but also internationally, there is no independent political solution for some of these things, right? We tried to do our best through politics and organizing, but political organizing and such as these things. But this relates to an ayat of in the Quran that surely Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what's inside themselves. And the Mufassirin, the scholars of Quran, say this, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his afiyah and his ni'mah is upon a group of people, meaning well-being. And this well-being has a meaning of protection from bala, from calamities. And ni'mah means blessing, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives this to a people. Then through their disobedience, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then changes or takes away that afiyah, that ni'mah, through that lack of shukr, that lack of thankfulness and gratitude, and through that lack of obedience, he takes it away. And when he takes away this afiyah and takes away this ni'mah, then those group of people then get humiliated, they get subjugated, and they have calamities come upon them. And those calamities aren't lifted until what? Until they return back to the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the command and following the way at ta'a wa ittiba Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. This is what the commentators of the Quran have said. Like, this is like basically the unanimous interpretation of this ayah, not just from Ahlul Sunnati wal Jama'ah or Sunni Muslims, but also from Ahlul Tashayyu or from the Shia as well. In conclusion, and this relates to Malcolm's call, a few months ago, I was meeting with some ulama. I was in Cairo, and I met with some ulama in a private meeting. And one of the scholars that was there, who's a descendant, actually a descendant of Sayyidina Hussein, he said this to me also in a group with my Murabbi Sheikh Ali Sulaiman, Ali Hafidullah Ta'ala, and a few other brothers. He said this. He says, "You Muslims," and he's very familiar with the social political scene here in the West and in America in particular. He said, "You Muslims in America," he said, "you do a lot of activity. You have a lot of organizing, a lot of activity." He says, "But it's not bearing the fruits that you wish to see for two reasons." And he said, in some cases, some of the activity may be bringing more harm to yourselves and to the ummah than good. And he said, number one, he says there are many people who are involved in this activity or this activism that aren't working on purifying their own selves, and thus they come into the work of activism with a noble goal, a noble maqsad, but the adab of how they're doing it, the mannerisms and the character of how they're trying to execute it is bad, and it's outside of prophetic character. Hence, it's not yielding the fruits or results. And then he said the second is that much of the activism is going outside of the sacred law, or we could say the Sharia. And he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessing and his tawfiq is not with it, with any endeavor that goes outside of the sacred law, right? So this is just something to keep in mind, and this goes back to the life of Malcolm X. That Malcolm X, especially as a Sunni, was very scrupulous in regards to his adherence to the Islamic teachings, and he never did el amr bil munkar in the sense of promoting those things that were haram in the name of trying to get justice for African American people, or for that matter for the ummah of Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his visits when he went to Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, and the other locations, Egypt, the countries in the Muslim world, Nigeria, and the places that he visited, and spoke on behalf of freedom, justice, and equality, not just for Black folks in America, but also for liberation of the Palestinian people and other people who are marginalized. So this is why I want to share with you, my brothers and sisters in Islam. And I encourage you that even if you don't agree with all of the comments of what I said, you're free to research them and share this video with other people, because I think that these lessons of Malcolm X need to be shared, especially from an Islam perspective, because many people who are non-Muslims have tried to frame Malcolm X only as a Black Marxist or a Pan-Africanist. And his foundation of what gave him a platform was the Nation of Islam. It wasn't Marxism. And when he came out of that, he was an unapologetic Sunni Muslim. He cared about his people, but all oppressed people. But we can't postulate and say what would he have been if he were still alive today. But we know what he lived upon and what he was martyred upon. And we know that, and based upon that, we can take some of those things and look at our contemporary challenges and our contemporary opportunities. Inshallah, we can, all of us, contemplate these and maybe readjust some of our positions, and maybe readjust some of our priorities in terms of how we look at social political issues for the American Muslim community. We ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz amongst the Shuhada. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have him reside in the highest levels of paradise with Hamza radiallahu an, and Ja'far at-Tayyar ibn Abi Talib radiallahu an, and Ammar bin Yasir radiallahu an, and Sumayya, his mother radiallahu anha, and with Sayyidina Hussein radiallahu an, and all of the other Shuhada amongst the Sahaba. We ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy upon his blessed wife, Al-Hajjah Dr. Betty Shabazz rahmatullah alayha, and have her be with him and those martyrs in Jannat al-Firdaus al-A'la in the Akhirah. We ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us and grant our Muslim community in America competence and courage, to grant us beneficial knowledge, and to give us refuge from knowledge which has no benefit. We ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us free of need of the people. We ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us istiqamah, to grant us uprightness in his commands and staying away from his prohibitions. We ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless our country and to guide the people of our country to the straight path. We ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for those of us who have non-Muslim family members to guide them to La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. We ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase the goodness and increase the rizq of all of those who are working on behalf of the da'wah of Islam and enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong according to the sacred law revealed to Al-Habib al-Mustafa Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make the African American people whole and to heal heal them, to heal my people from their trauma of this 400 years here in the United States of America, which mirrors the 400 years of the Beni Israel, the children of Israel, who were enslaved and subjugated in in Egypt under Pharaoh. We ask Allah, Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to give those people, to give my people liberation as Beni Israel was liberated from Fir'aun. Ya Rabbil Alameen. Ya Hanan, Ya Manan, Ya Badi as-samawati wa ardi, Ya Dhul Jalali Ikram, Ya Hayyun, Ya Qayyum, Birahmatika nastaghith. We ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make this Yom al-Jum'ah, this day of blessings, a means of connecting us with Al-Habib al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have us all meet him at the hawd, to meet him at the basin, and drink from his hands, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that our thirst may be quenched on the day of judgment. Ya Rabbil Alameen. We ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the intercession, the shafa'ah of our master, of our Habib, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and to grant us in the gentle Fadawsa ala bi khairul hisab, to grant us into the highest level of paradise without any reckoning, Ya Rabbil Alameen. And we ask Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through his tawfiq, to protect our children, Ya Allah. To protect our children, Ya Allah. To protect our children from fawahish and from munkarat, Ya Rabbil Alameen. And to have us be role models for them, such as Malcolm X is a role model for us, Ya Rabbil Alameen. Subhana rabbika bi'izzati amma yasifun, wa salamun ala al-mursaleen, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, maliki yawm ad-din, iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'een, ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim, غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And please, on this Jum'ah day, in which we are encouraged to increase our good deeds, including sadaqah, please give a donation to CAIR Michigan today, and keep us in mind in your sadaqah of the day. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.